Today, we will talk about Princess Cecilia of Greece and Denmark. Now, that name might not ring as many bells as, say, Queen Victoria or Diana, Princess of Wales, and that's precisely why her story is so compelling. She was the sister of a man the whole world would come to know, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. But before he was the steadfast consort to the British Queen, he was a younger brother who adored his 4 older sisters. And Cecilia, with her dark hair and soulful eyes, was one of them. Imagine for a moment a life of almost fairy tale privilege, palaces, titles, connections to every great royal house in Europe. Now imagine that life is built on shifting sands, where at any moment revolution or war could sweep it all away, leaving you a royal with no kingdom, a prince with no palace. That was the world Cecilia was born into. Her story culminates in a single horrifying event in the foggy skies over Belgium in 1937, a plane crash that would annihilate her entire young family in one fiery instant. And woven into this tragedy is a quiet, chilling rumor that in her final moments, 8 months pregnant and plummeting from the sky, she simply accepted her fate. How does a person arrive at such a place of profound, almost surreal resignation? To understand that, we can't start at the end. We have to go back to the very beginning. We have to immerse ourselves in the glittering yet deeply unstable world of early 20th century European royalty. A world on the brink of blowing itself apart and taking its princes and princesses along with it. This is the story of a life lived in the shadow of falling thrones, and of a love that met a truly terrible end. This is the story of Princess Cecilia. To grasp the world Cecilia was born into in 1911, you first have to understand the immense, sprawling family tree that was European royalty. And at its root, for the better part of a century, sat one formidable woman, Queen Victoria. By the time of her death in 1901, she wasn't just the Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India. She was, quite literally, the grandmother of Europe. Her 9 children and 42 grandchildren were strategically married into nearly every significant royal house on the continent, from the mighty German and Russian empires to the smaller kingdoms of Scandinavia and the Balkans. This was more than just family matchmaking. It was a form of international diplomacy. The idea was that these close familial bonds, cousins ruling in Berlin, St. Petersburg, and London, would create a web of kinship so strong that major conflicts between them would be unthinkable. A family, after all, does not go to war with itself. It was a beautiful, optimistic theory, and it was tragically, catastrophically wrong. By the time Cecilia was born, this grand Victorian dream was beginning to fray at the edges. The personal relationships between these royal cousins were often fraught with rivalry and suspicion. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Victoria's first grandchild, had a notoriously complex and competitive relationship with his British cousins, including King George V. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, whose wife Alexandra was another of Victoria's granddaughters, found himself caught between his alliances. These were not just monarchs. They were relatives with all the love, jealousy, and resentment that any family can contain. But their personal squabbles had the power to move armies and redraw maps. Into this intricate, high-stakes family drama came the House of Glucksburg, officially the ruling dynasty of Denmark, but with branches that had been placed on the thrones of other nations, including Norway, and, most pertinently for our story, Greece. This is where Cecilia's lineage lies. Her grandfather was King George I of Greece, but he hadn't been born a Greek prince. He was born Prince Wilhelm of Denmark. In 1863, after the previous Greek king was deposed, the great powers of Britain, France, and Russia decided that this young Danish prince would be a suitable candidate for the unstable Greek throne. He arrived in a country he didn't know to rule a people whose language he didn't speak, a perfect example of how royalty in this era were often just pawns in a much larger geopolitical game. So from the very beginning, Cecilia's family was part of a transplanted monarchy. They were seen by some Greeks as foreign imports, a Danish dynasty ruling over Hellenic lands. This created a permanent sense of precariousness. Unlike the ancient monarchies of Britain or Spain, their position was not rooted in centuries of national tradition. It was conditional, dependent on political favor, military success, and the whims of the Greek people and their powerful international patrons. This constant underlying instability was the air that Cecilia and her siblings would breathe from the moment they were born. They were Greek royalty, yes, but their hold on that title was tenuous at best. They were living in a gilded cage, but the foundations of that cage were built on a fault line, and the tremors were growing stronger every year. Before there was Cecilia, there was the story of her parents, a union that in itself embodied the complexities and contradictions of their world. Her father was Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, the fourth son of King George I of Greece. Andrew was a handsome career military man. He was charming, perhaps a little aimless as a fourth son, with little prospect of ever ruling, but deeply embedded in the life of the Greek army and state. He was, by all accounts, a patriot for his adopted homeland. Her mother, however, was someone truly extraordinary, Princess Alice of Battenberg. To understand Cecilia, you must first understand the incredible life force that was her mother. Alice was born in Windsor Castle in 1885, in the presence of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria herself. She was a member of the British royal family, yet her background was German. The Battenbergs were a morganatic branch of the House of Hesse, a German Grand Duchy. Her father, Prince Louis of Battenberg, had forsaken his German roots to embark on a brilliant career in the British Royal Navy, eventually rising to the very top as First Sea Lord. Alice was born congenitally deaf in an era that often hid away or institutionalized those with disabilities. Her mother, Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, another of Queen Victoria's children, Victoria's granddaughters, was determined that Alice would lead a full life. She painstakingly taught her daughter to lip read and speak, not just in English, but in German and later French and Greek. As a result, Alice became a remarkably astute observer of people, her focus sharpened by her deafness. She was intelligent, strong-willed, and possessed a striking ethereal beauty. Andrew and Alice met in 1902 at the coronation of King Edward VII in London. Andrew, a dashing young Greek prince, was immediately captivated by the beautiful and intriguing Princess Alice. A romance blossomed, and they were married the following year in Darmstadt, Germany, the home of her Hessian relatives. It was a grand European royal affair with 3 separate ceremonies, a Lutheran one for her family, an Orthodox one for his, and a civil one to make it all legal. Their early married life in Athens seemed idyllic. They lived in a palace befitting their station, and their family quickly grew. First came Margarita in 1905, then Theodora in 1906, and in 1911, their third daughter, Cecilia, was born at Tatoi Palace, the royal family's summer estate just outside Athens. Imagine the scene: a beautiful summer palace nestled in the Greek countryside, a growing family of princesses, a handsome father in his military uniform, and a mother renowned for her grace and beauty. It seemed like the perfect royal portrait. But beneath this serene surface, the ground was already shaking. Alice, for all her strength, struggled with the pressures of her life. Her deafness isolated her at times, and she threw herself into deep spiritual and philosophical exploration, a search for meaning that would define much of her later life. Andrew, meanwhile, was deeply enmeshed in the volatile world of Greek politics and military affairs, and that world was about to explode. The years of Cecilia's infancy were marked by almost constant warfare. First came the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. Greece, alongside its Balkan allies, fought to push the Ottoman Empire out of Europe. Prince Andrew served with distinction, and the wars resulted in Greece significantly expanding its territory. There were street parades and national celebrations. For a moment, it seemed the Greek monarchy was more secure than ever, basking in the glory of military victory. But this success was short-lived. Just 1 year later, in 1914, a gunshot in Sarajevo plunged the entire continent into the Great War. The First World War created an impossible dilemma for the Greek royal family. Cecilia's grandfather, King George I, had been assassinated in 1913, and his son, Constantine I, was now on the throne. King Constantine was married to Sophia of Prussia, the sister of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II. The king was therefore understandably sympathetic to the German cause. However, the Greek prime minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, was vehemently pro-Allied, believing Greece's future lay with Britain and France. This disagreement tore the country in two. It became known as the National Schism. For a young family like Prince Andrew and Princess Alice's, it was a personal and political nightmare. Their loyalties were hopelessly divided. Alice's father was the head of the British Navy, fighting against Germany. Her brother, Louis Mountbatten, was serving on British ships. Meanwhile, many of their German cousins were fighting and dying on the other side. King Constantine's determination to keep Greece neutral was seen by the Allies as a pro-German stance, and pressure on him mounted. For the young Cecilia and her sisters, these earth-shattering events would have been felt as a strange, tense atmosphere within the palace walls. The worried, hushed conversations of their parents, the disappearance of familiar faces, the growing animosity on the streets of Athens. They were children, shielded from the worst of it, but the fear and uncertainty must have seeped into their lives. In 1917, things came to a head. The Allies, determined to bring Greece into the war on their side, blockaded the country and ultimately threatened to bombard Athens. King Constantine was forced to abdicate and go into exile. Prince Andrew and his family, including 6-year-old Cecilia, had to flee with him. They packed what they could and left their home, their country, and their future behind. Their first exile was spent in German-speaking Switzerland. For Cecilia, this was a formative experience. Suddenly, the structure and routine of palace life were gone. They were a royal family living in a hotel, their finances uncertain, their future a complete blank. They were refugees, albeit very privileged ones. It was during this period of exile that Princess Alice's deep spiritual quest intensified. She found solace in Orthodox Christianity, but her beliefs began to blend with more esoteric ideas, and those around her started to worry about her mental state. The strain of the war, the exile, and her personal struggles were taking a heavy toll. For the children, it was a time of confusion. Their identity was fractured. Were they Greek, Danish, German, British? They spoke a mixture of languages at home. They were surrounded by family, but that family was scattered across a continent at war with itself. This experience of displacement and identity crisis would profoundly shape Cecilia's generation of royals. They were, in many ways, the first truly international and perhaps stateless generation. The war ended in 1918, but the family's exile continued. The political situation in Greece remained unstable. Then, in 1920, a strange twist of fate brought them back. The young king, who had replaced Constantine, died unexpectedly from a monkey bite, and a referendum was held which overwhelmingly voted for Constantine's return. So the family packed their bags once more and returned to Greece. For 9-year-old Cecilia, it must have been a joyous homecoming, a return to the sunshine and familiarity of Tatoi Palace. But this return to paradise would be devastatingly brief. Upon their return, Greece was embroiled in another brutal conflict, the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922. It was a disastrous campaign for Greece. Prince Andrew, who held a senior command, was made a scapegoat for the catastrophic defeat. When a military coup overthrew the monarchy once again in 1922, King Constantine was forced into exile for a final time, where he would die shortly after. Prince Andrew was arrested, court-martialed by the new revolutionary government, and charged with disobeying orders and acting on his own initiative during a key battle. The charges were serious and the atmosphere was venomous. There was a very real possibility that he would be executed as a traitor. Princess Alice, pregnant with her 5th child, worked tirelessly to save him. She appealed to her relatives across Europe. King George V of Great Britain intervened, sending a naval cruiser, HMS Calypso, to Athens. The British government put immense pressure on the Greek regime, and Prince Andrew's sentence was commuted from death to perpetual banishment. In December 1922, the family was forced to flee once more. Prince Andrew, Princess Alice, and their 4 daughters, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and the youngest, Sophie, boarded the British warship. With them was a newborn baby boy born just a few months earlier on the island of Corfu. He was bundled into a makeshift cot fashioned from an orange crate. That baby was Prince Philip. 11-year-old Cecilia was now in exile for the 2nd time in her young life. This time, it felt permanent. Their Greek citizenship was stripped away. They traveled on Danish passports, a constant reminder of their transplanted roots. They were homeless, living on the charity of relatives in Paris, London, and Germany. The trauma of this period cannot be overstated. The near execution of their father, the loss of their home, their country, their status, it shattered the family. Prince Andrew was a broken man, embittered and defeated. And Princess Alice, who had fought so hard to save him, finally succumbed to the immense strain. Her spiritual fervor intensified into religious fanaticism, and she began to experience severe mental health crises. The family that had fled Greece together was about to fall apart completely. This was the fractured, tragic world that would forge the woman Princess Cecilia was to become. When we left the story of Princess Cecilia, she was an 11-year-old girl on a British warship, fleeing her home for the 2nd and final time. With her were her 3 sisters, her embittered father, her distraught mother, and a baby brother Philip, sleeping in an orange crate. They had escaped with their lives, but the family that sailed away from Greece in 1922 was already broken, and the years that followed would see it shatter completely. This next chapter of Cecilia's life is one of profound loss, not of status or country, but of something far more fundamental: the loss of her family, her parents, and the very foundation of a normal childhood. It is in the ashes of this family that the resilient, quiet, and tragically fated young woman would be forged. Their new life began in a suburb of Paris called Saint-Cloud. They lived in a house loaned to them by Prince Andrew's wealthy sister-in-law, Princess George of Greece and Denmark, Marie Bonaparte. On the surface, it may have seemed comfortable enough. They were safe and they were together. But the psychological wounds of their exile ran deep. They were the poor relations, living on handouts, a constant humiliating reminder of all they had lost. The trauma of the court-martial had hollowed out Prince Andrew. He felt betrayed by the country he had served, and this bitterness curdled into a permanent detachment. He began to spend less and less time at home, drifting towards the sunnier, more carefree climes of the French Riviera. There, he could forget his responsibilities, living the life of a playboy supported by his mistresses. He didn't formally abandon his children, but he retreated from their lives, leaving a void where a father should have been. With Andrew emotionally and physically absent, the entire weight of the family's trauma fell upon Princess Alice, and it was a weight she could no longer bear. Her deep religious faith, which had once been a source of strength, spiraled into what her doctors would diagnose as schizophrenia. She began to declare that she was receiving divine messages, that she had healing powers, and that she was the bride of Christ. For her young daughters, it must have been terrifying and deeply confusing to watch their brilliant, beautiful mother slip away from them into a private world they couldn't enter. Cecilia, now a teenager, along with her older sisters Margarita and Theodora, had to take on the role of caregivers, not just for their younger siblings, but for their own mother. By 1930, Alice's condition had become so severe that the family made the agonizing decision to have her committed against her will. She was taken to a sanatorium in Berlin and later to a famous psychiatric clinic in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, run by Dr. Ludwig Binswanger. He diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia and recommended a horrifying course of treatment promoted by Sigmund Freud, X-raying her ovaries to kill off her libido and supposedly cure her frustrations. It was a brutal and medically unsound procedure that did nothing to help her. For the next several years, Alice was a prisoner of the European psychiatric system. She was cut off from all contact with her family. She did not see her children for over 5 years. And just like that, at the age of 19, Cecilia and her siblings were, for all intents and purposes, orphans. Their father was absent on the Riviera, and their mother was locked away in an institution. The family unit ceased to exist. The 4 sisters and their younger brother Philip were scattered across Europe, parceled out to various relatives who were willing to take them in. The 2 eldest, Margarita and Theodora, soon married German princes. Young Philip was sent to England to be raised by his grandmother, Victoria Mountbatten, and his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten. And Cecilia, the dark-haired beauty with the quiet, soulful eyes, also found a new home in Germany. She went to live with her mother's relatives, the House of Hesse, at their ancestral homes of Wolfsgarten and Darmstadt. It was here, amidst the stability and tradition of one of Germany's oldest dynasties, that Cecilia would finally find a sense of belonging. It was here that she would come of age, fall in love, and begin to build the family life that had been so violently torn from her as a child. It seemed, for a brief hopeful moment, that she had finally escaped the storm. To understand the world Cecilia stepped into, you have to picture Germany in the late 1920s and early 1930s. This was the era of the Weimar Republic, a period of incredible artistic innovation and social freedom, but also of crippling economic depression, political violence, and national humiliation following the First World War. For the old German aristocracy, like the House of Hesse, it was a bewildering time. Their titles were officially gone, the Kaiser was in exile, and their privileged world had been turned upside down. Yet they still lived in their grand castles, maintained their traditions, and sought to preserve their way of life against the rising tides of modernism and political extremism. The Hessian family that took Cecilia in was presided over by the Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig, Princess Alice's brother. He was a great patron of the arts and had made Darmstadt a center of the Jugendstil Art Nouveau movement. Life at their castles, Wolfsgarten and the Neue Palais in Darmstadt, was a world away from the chaotic, hand-to-mouth existence of her family's exile in Paris. Here, there was order, culture, and a deep sense of history and duty. For a young woman who had known nothing but instability, it must have felt like a safe harbor. It was in this environment that Cecilia truly blossomed. Her striking beauty became the subject of much admiration. She was tall and elegant, with the dark hair and features of her Greek father, but there was a softness, a gentle melancholy in her expression that was all her own. The photographer Cecil Beaton, a great arbiter of style and beauty, would later describe her as by far the most beautiful of the beautiful sisters. She had the face of a Botticelli angel. But her beauty was not just external. Those who knew her spoke of her kindness, her quiet empathy, and her innate grace, qualities likely honed by the immense difficulties of her childhood. Having had to grow up so quickly, she possessed a maturity and poise beyond her years, and it was here, within this close-knit family circle, that she found love. Her intended was Georg Donatus, the hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine. Known to his family as Don, he was the son of Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig, making him Cecilia's first cousin once removed. A romance between them was seen as natural, almost inevitable. In the world of European royalty, marrying within the extended family was not just common, it was expected. It kept titles and fortunes consolidated and ensured a shared cultural and social understanding. Don was a handsome and charming young man, and by all accounts their connection was a genuine love match. He was drawn to her beauty and gentle spirit, and she, in turn, found in him the promise of stability, love, and the chance to finally build a home of her own. Their courtship was a world away from the grand, politically motivated royal pairings of the previous generation. It was a personal, intimate affair, a bond forged between two people who shared a common background and a hope for a peaceful future. Their engagement was announced in 1930, a beacon of happy news for a family that had known so much sorrow. For Cecilia, who had lost her mother to illness and her father to indifference, finding Don must have felt like finding an anchor in a turbulent sea. She was finally going to have her own family. On the 2nd of February 1931, 20-year-old Princess Cecilia married 24-year-old Georg Donatus in a lavish ceremony at the Schlosskirche in Darmstadt. The wedding was one of the last great gatherings of European royalty before the Second World War tore the continent apart for good. It was a roll call of Cecilia's scattered family. Her father, Prince Andrew, emerged from his seclusion in the south of France to walk his daughter down the aisle. Her 3 sisters were there, as was her young brother, Philip, a spirited 10-year-old in a formal suit. Lord Louis Mountbatten represented the British side of the family. It was a reunion, a moment of joy and unity in their fractured lives. But there was one heartbreaking absence. Cecilia's mother, Princess Alice, was not there to see her daughter marry. She was still confined to the sanatorium in Switzerland, unaware of the happy occasion. The joy of the day was undoubtedly tinged with this profound sadness for Cecilia. The person who had shaped her earliest years, the mother she had cared for and then lost, could not share in her happiness. It's a poignant detail that underscores the deep scars her childhood had left. With her marriage, Cecilia became the hereditary Grand Duchess of Hesse and by Rhine. She embraced her new role with the grace and seriousness that defined her. She moved into the family palace at Wolfsgarten, and for the first time since she was a little girl in Athens, she had a true home. She quickly became a mother herself. Her first son, Prince Ludwig, was born later that same year in 1931. A second son, Prince Alexander, followed in 1933, and in 1936, A daughter, Princess Johanna, completed their family. By all accounts, Cecilia adored being a mother. She poured all the love and desire for stability that she had been denied as a child into her own children. Photographs from this period show a radiant young woman surrounded by her husband and her beautiful babies. She had created her own little world, a sanctuary of domestic happiness. After a childhood defined by chaos and loss, she had finally found peace. She had a loving husband, beautiful children, a home, and a purpose. This period from 1931 to 1937 represented the happiest years of her life. It was a brief sunlit chapter, a fragile moment of calm before the arrival of an unimaginable storm. But outside the palace walls of Wolfsgarten, the world was changing at a terrifying pace. The Germany in which Cecilia was building her happy family was not the cultured, artistic nation of her uncle, the Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig. The Weimar Republic was dead. The streets echoed with the marching of brown-shirted stormtroopers, and the air was thick with the hateful rhetoric of a new political force. The shadow of the swastika was falling across the land, and even the ancient and noble House of Hesse would not be immune to its dark allure. On January 30th, 1933, just as Cecilia was settling into her life as a young mother, with her second child on the way, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The Nazi Party's rise to power was swift and total. For many Germans, weary of economic depression, political infighting, and the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, the Nazis offered a seductive promise: the restoration of national pride, economic stability, and order. For the German aristocracy, the Nazi movement presented a complex and often contradictory proposition. On the one hand, the Nazis were a vulgar populist movement, led by men the nobility considered their social inferiors. Their ideology was brutal, and their methods thuggish. On the other hand, the Nazis were fervently nationalistic and virulently anti-communist. For a class that had seen their Russian relatives, the Romanovs, murdered by Bolsheviks, the Nazis' promise to stamp out communism was deeply appealing. Many aristocrats also harbored a deep resentment towards the Weimar Republic, which they blamed for the loss of their power and status. Some believed they could co-opt or control the Nazi movement, using it to restore a more traditional monarchical order. They were, of course, terribly mistaken. Cecilia's new family was caught in these swirling political currents. Her father-in-law, Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig, who had been the last reigning Grand Duke of Hesse, despised the Nazis for their vulgarity and brutality. He represented the old world of culture and enlightened monarchy. However, after his death in October 1937, the situation changed. Cecilia's husband, Don, and his younger brother, Prince Louis, found themselves navigating this dangerous new landscape. On May 1st, 1937, a few months before the final tragedy, Cecilia and her husband, Georg Donatus, both joined the Nazi Party. This is a deeply uncomfortable and controversial fact in their story. Why did they do it? The historical record is not entirely clear on their personal motivations. It's possible they were true believers in the Nazi ideology. It's also possible it was a pragmatic choice, a move made to protect their family, their property, and their position in the new Germany. Many aristocrats joined the party out of a sense of opportunism or self-preservation. Refusing to join could be seen as an act of defiance, which carried enormous risks. Several of Cecilia's own sisters and their German husbands were also deeply involved with the Nazi regime. Her sister Sophie's first husband, Prince Christoph of Hesse, was a high-ranking SS officer who worked directly with Himmler. The lines between royalty and the Nazi Party became disturbingly blurred. It is a stark reminder that history is not a simple story of heroes and villains. People, even princesses, make complex, sometimes morally compromised choices driven by fear, ambition, and the overwhelming political pressures of their time. This decision to join the party casts a dark shadow over the idyllic image of Cecilia's family life. It complicates her legacy and forces us to see her not just as a tragic victim, but as a historical figure living through one of humanity's darkest chapters. Her life, which had been so defined by personal family tragedy, was now inextricably linked to a political tragedy of a monstrous scale. And it was against this backdrop of rising political darkness that the final personal tragedy was about to unfold. Her brief period of happiness was over. Fate was closing in. The year is 1937. Europe is a continent holding its breath. The shadows of Nazism are lengthening across Germany and beyond. The whispers of another great war are growing louder. For Princess Cecilia, now 26 years old, the world outside her Hessian palaces must have felt increasingly volatile. Yet, within the walls of Wolfsgarten and Darmstadt, she had built a beautiful, if fragile, sanctuary. She had a loving husband, Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse, and 3 beautiful children, Ludwig, Alexander, and Johanna. And now she was heavily pregnant again, due to give birth to her 4th child. It was a time of immense personal joy, overshadowed by the darkening political landscape of their adopted Germany. But even as the world around them seemed to descend into madness, life, with its personal milestones and celebrations, continued its inexorable march. And it was a family milestone that would ultimately set the stage for the unimaginable. Georg Donatus, Cecilia's beloved husband, had a younger brother, Prince Louis of Hesse, and by Rhine. Louis, known affectionately in the family as Lou to distinguish him from his brother Don, was a charming and somewhat free-spirited individual. He had recently become engaged to a woman who was not of royal blood, a fact that would have raised eyebrows in an earlier generation, but was becoming increasingly common as the old social barriers began to crumble. Her name was the Honorable Margaret Campbell Geddes, the daughter of a prominent British peer, Lord Geddes. Their wedding was set to be a grand affair, scheduled for November 20th, 1937. And where else would such an Anglo-German union take place but in London, the heart of the British Empire and the ancestral home of so many of Cecilia's own relatives? For the dispersed Greek royal family, and indeed for many of the intertwined royal houses of Europe, a major wedding was more than just a celebration. It was a rare opportunity for family reunions. It was a chance to see cousins, aunts, and uncles to share stories and momentarily forget the rising tensions that threatened to tear their continent apart. Cecilia, 8 months pregnant, felt a deep personal obligation to attend. This wasn't just a matter of social etiquette, it was a matter of family. Her brother-in-law was marrying, and she felt it was her duty, her desire to be there. And here we might pause and reflect on the subtle forces that guide our lives, the seemingly small decisions that set us on an irreversible course. Had the wedding been postponed, had Cecilia felt too unwell to travel, had any number of minor details shifted, history might have unfolded very differently, but Cecilia, with her characteristic determination and devotion to family, made the choice to go. In the 1930s, air travel was a far cry from the routine, relatively safe experience we know today. It was still a new, somewhat perilous mode of transport, particularly for civilian flights. Planes were smaller, less reliable, and navigation through adverse weather conditions was primitive compared to modern standards. For a heavily pregnant woman, an air journey across Europe was not without its considerable risks. a fact that surely must have been considered. Yet the call of family, the allure of celebration, and perhaps a desire for a brief escape from the somber atmosphere in Germany prevailed. The decision was made. The Donatus Hesse family would fly from Darmstadt to London for the wedding. The morning of Tuesday, November 16th, 1937 dawned, by many accounts clear and bright over Darmstadt, Germany. There was no immediate sign of the impending tragedy as hereditary Grand Duke Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duchess Cecilia, and their 3 young children prepared to depart from the local airfield. The children were Prince Ludwig, age 6, Prince Alexander, age 4, and Princess Johanna, a lively, curious 1-year-old. They were not traveling alone. Also accompanying them was Georg Donatus's mother, Grand Duchess Eleanor of Hesse, and by Rhine, a dignified woman of advanced years. Her presence was typical for a royal family traveling to an important event. She likely wished to share in the family celebration and support her son and daughter-in-law. A lady-in-waiting, Frau Kneisel, completed the party. The aircraft they boarded was a Junkers Ju-52, a German-made trimotor plane, one of the workhorses of European aviation at the time. It was a robust and widely used aircraft, but it was still a product of its era. This particular plane belonged to the Belgian national airline, Sabena, and was piloted by Captain Antoine Lambot, an experienced aviator. The initial leg of the flight was uneventful. The family would have enjoyed the novelty of flying, the views from above. For the children, it must have been an adventure. Perhaps Cecilia, looking out at the patchwork quilt of the German landscape, allowed herself a moment of serene contentment. She had her husband, her children, her baby stirring within her, and the anticipation of a joyous family gathering. All the past traumas, the exile, the disintegration of her parents' marriage, her mother's illness, the political upheavals, must have seemed for a brief fleeting moment to be firmly behind her. The future, in that moment, held only the promise of a wedding and the warmth of family. However, as the plane made its way westward toward the Belgian coast, the weather began to change dramatically. Unbeknownst to those on board, a thick, persistent fog bank was rapidly descending across the North Sea and the Low Countries. It was an insidious, silent adversary, one that no human ingenuity or early 20th century aviation technology could effectively conquer. The sky above them might have been clear, but ahead, a wall of impenetrable white was forming, drawing a veil of secrecy over the fate that awaited them. The flight plan for the Junkers Ju-52 included a scheduled stop in Ostend, Belgium for refueling. This was standard practice for flights of this distance in those days. As the aircraft approached the Belgian coast, the weather situation deteriorated rapidly. The ground, which had been visible and clear from Darmstadt, was now obscured by an increasingly dense fog. Captain Lambot, the pilot, would have been acutely aware of the worsening conditions. Flying in heavy fog with the navigational tools available in 1937 was incredibly challenging and fraught with danger. Pilots relied heavily on visual cues, and when those cues were obliterated, the risk of spatial disorientation and collision increased exponentially. Upon landing in Ostend, the decision was made to refuel. It was during this stop that the critical final moments of their journey began to unfold. According to various accounts, the fog was already thick around the airport. Visibility would have been extremely poor. Had Captain Lambot known the full extent of what lay ahead, or perhaps had clearer instructions from ground control, he might have chosen to delay the flight or even cancel it outright. But the pressure to proceed to stick to the schedule for such an important party must have been immense. In hindsight, every minute spent on the ground in Ostend was a minute closer to their tragic destiny. As the plane prepared for takeoff from Ostensteen Airport, the fog had intensified even further. Local reports from the time described visibility as being reduced to mere meters. It was a perilous situation, one that would test the limits of even the most experienced pilot. Witnesses on the ground, those few who could see through the swirling white, would later recount a sense of unease. The roar of the engines in the dense fog. The plane struggled to gain altitude. It was a moment pregnant with tension, an omen of the disaster that was about to strike. The decision to take off was made, and the Junkers Ju-52 began its ascent into the oppressive, suffocating white. The runway lights would have been barely visible, and the pilot would have been straining to find any visual reference points. Above them, an unseen, immovable object awaited. The moment of impact was sudden, violent, and utterly devastating. As the Junkers Ju-52 struggled to gain altitude in the thick fog shortly after taking off from Ostensteen Airport, its left wing struck a brick factory chimney. The impact was catastrophic. The wing was immediately torn off, sending the aircraft into an uncontrolled descent. It plunged to the ground, hitting the earth with tremendous force, and immediately burst into flames. The wreckage was scattered across a wide area, a scene of absolute devastation. There were no survivors. Everyone on board, Hereditary Grand Duke Georg Donatus, Hereditary Grand Duchess Cecilia, their sons Ludwig and Alexander, their daughter Johanna, Grand Duchess Eleanor, and Frau Kneisel, perished instantly in the inferno. The news of the crash spread like wildfire, first locally in Belgium and then across the wires of Europe, reaching the interconnected royal families with shocking speed. Prince Louis, waiting in London for his family to arrive for his wedding, received the news just hours before the ceremony. It was a day meant for joy that was instead plunged into unimaginable sorrow. His wedding, of course, was immediately postponed, a personal tragedy of immense scale playing out against the backdrop of a public, shared grief across nations. The initial reports were grim enough, but then came a detail that added an almost unbearable layer of horror to the tragedy. During the investigation of the crash site, among the twisted metal and smoldering debris, a medical examination revealed a shocking discovery. Princess Cecilie, heavily pregnant, had gone into labor during the terrifying final moments of the flight. Her fourth child, a full-term baby girl, was found among the wreckage, stillborn, her tiny body lying separate from Cecilia's, suggesting a desperate final struggle to bring life into the world as death closed in. This detail, though difficult to confirm with absolute certainty given the nature of the crash, has been widely reported and accepted within historical accounts and family lore. It paints a harrowing picture of Cecilia's final moments. In the grip of a terrifying aerial disaster, she was also enduring the intense pain of childbirth. It speaks to a profound and almost mythical level of suffering, a stark illustration of the raw, brutal fragility of life. This final, desperate act of motherhood, unfolding amidst the chaos of a fiery plane crash, transformed an already tragic event into something truly extraordinary and deeply, deeply moving. It ensured that the story of Princess Cecilie would be forever etched into the annals of royal history, a symbol of unimaginable loss and the cruelest whims of fate. The entire Hessian family, save for the newly widowed Prince Louis, had been wiped out in a single catastrophic blow. A dynasty, once powerful and ancient, had effectively come to an end in the skies over Belgium. The crash was not just a personal tragedy. It was a devastating historical event, a brutal reminder of the precariousness of life, even for those born into privilege. A plane crash, a pillar of smoke against a gray Belgian sky. In one fiery, incomprehensible moment, a family, a lineage, an entire future had been extinguished. But the story of Princess Cecilia does not end in that field in Ostend. The impact of the crash was not confined to the twisted wreckage. It sent shockwaves of grief across a continent, forcing a wedding to become a funeral and leaving behind a legacy of sorrow, unanswered questions, and one final crushing tragedy that is so often overlooked. This is the story of the aftermath, of the echoes left behind in the silence, and of the enduring legend of a princess who, in the face of absolute horror, was said to have simply accepted her fate. In London, the mood was one of festive anticipation. Guests were arriving for the wedding of Prince Louis of Hesse and the Honorable Margaret Geddes. Flowers were arranged. Formal attire was prepared. Then the telegram arrived. The news was so horrific, so complete in its devastation that it was at first met with disbelief. The groom's entire immediate family, his brother, his sister-in-law, his mother, his nephews, and his niece, were all gone. Among the guests already in London was Cecilia's 16-year-old brother, Prince Philip. He had traveled from his strict boarding school, Gordonstoun in Scotland, looking forward to seeing his beloved sister and her family. The devastating task of informing the young cadet fell to his uncle and guardian, Lord Louis Mountbatten. Philip, even at that tender age, displayed the stoic, almost impenetrable resolve that would define his public persona for the next 80 years. He received the news of the death of his favorite sister with a stony face, betraying no outward emotion. But beneath that carefully constructed armor, the grief must have been a raw, gaping wound. It was a loss that would shape him in profound ways. Another abandonment in a childhood already defined by exile and the loss of his parents. In the face of this overwhelming tragedy, Prince Louis and Margaret Geddes made a remarkable decision. The grand wedding was, of course, canceled. But the following day, on November 17, 1937, in a small private ceremony, they were married. They stood before the altar cloaked in black mourning clothes, their vows exchanged not amidst celebration, but amidst the rawest of grief. It was not an act of disrespect, but one of profound love and resilience, a declaration that even in the face of death, life and love must find a way to continue. Their union, born in sorrow, would become a testament to duty and devotion. Immediately after this somber ceremony, the family began the grim journey to Darmstadt, Germany. Prince Philip, who had arrived for a wedding, now had to attend the funeral of his sister and her entire family. He would walk in a procession through a German city, a city that was now the heartland of the rising Nazi regime. The personal tragedy of a family was about to collide with the ominous stagecraft of history. The funeral for the Hessian family, held in Darmstadt in late November 1937, was a surreal and deeply poignant spectacle. The streets were lined with thousands of grieving citizens, a city in mourning for its lost ducal family. 5 coffins for Cecilia, Dawn, their 2 sons Ludwig and Alexander, and the Grand Duchess Eleanor, were drawn on horse-drawn carriages through the city to Rosenhöhe, the family's traditional burial ground. The procession of mourners was a snapshot of a world on the verge of tearing itself apart. Walking side by side were figures from starkly opposing worlds. There was the British contingent, Lord Mountbatten in the uniform of a Royal Navy captain, and a tall, solemn Prince Philip, his face a mask of grief. And walking near them, in a grotesque display of official condolence, were high-ranking members of the Nazi Party. Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful and brutal men in the Third Reich, was there in his elaborate Luftwaffe uniform. Brown-shirted SA troops lined the streets, their arms raised not in their customary salute, but holding back the mourning crowds. Think of that image. The swastika, the symbol of a regime that would soon plunge Britain and the world into a devastating war, provided the backdrop for the funeral of a British prince's sister. It was a moment of shocking visual dissonance, a gathering of future enemies united for a fleeting moment by a shared human tragedy. For Prince Philip, it was a profound and formative experience. He was forced to confront not only the personal devastation of his sister's death, but also the chilling political reality of the country she had called home. He saw firsthand the pageantry and the power of the Nazi regime, a regime that many of his German relatives had embraced. The memory of walking through those streets surrounded by swastikas would stay with him for the rest of his life. The family was laid to rest, but the grief was far from over. Cecilia's mother, Princess Alice, received the news in the sanatorium where she was still a patient. The shock of losing her daughter, her son-in-law, and 3 of her grandchildren in such a brutal fashion was immense. Yet for Alice, this colossal tragedy seemed to serve as a strange and terrible catalyst. It was a shock so profound that it seemed to pierce through the veil of her illness, reconnecting her with the stark reality of the world. It would mark the beginning of her long, slow journey back to her family and to herself. In the wake of such a senseless, violent end, the human mind desperately seeks meaning, a narrative to make the unbearable bearable. And so, a legend was born, a piece of family lore that has attached itself to Cecilia's final moments with quiet insistence, the story that she accepted her fate. Where did this idea come from? There were, of course, no survivors to report on her final moments. This was not an eyewitness account. Instead, it seems to have been born from the family's interpretation of her character, and perhaps as a spiritual balm for their own grief, most likely shaped by the profound mysticism of her mother, Princess Alice. It was a way of transforming Cecilia from a mere victim of a mechanical failure into a figure of almost spiritual transcendence. But what could it truly mean to accept such a fate? It certainly doesn't mean she was suicidal or wished for death. Rather, it speaks to a profound psychological state, a deep-seated stoicism that may have been the defining feature of her character. Consider the life she had lived, a childhood of exile, of being a refugee, of watching her father retreat and her mother break down. She had known from a very young age that life was precarious, that security was an illusion, and that even the grandest titles offered no protection from suffering. This lifetime of instability may have forged in her a powerful sense of resignation, not as a weakness, but as a form of inner strength. Furthermore, we must consider the extraordinary biological event occurring in those final terrifying moments. She was giving birth. It is a powerful and moving thought that as the plane was plummeting, as the world outside the cabin dissolved into a chaos of noise and motion, her entire being may have been consumed by the primal, overwhelming instinct to bring her child into the world. In that moment, perhaps the fear of her own death became secondary to the profound biological imperative of motherhood. This interpretation shifts the narrative from one of passive acceptance to one of an incredible final act of maternal love and focus. Her acceptance was not of her death, but of her role as a mother, even at the very threshold of oblivion. It's a legend that makes her final act not one of terror, but one of profound, heartbreaking purpose. The story of the tragedy is not yet complete. There is one final, devastating chapter that is often forgotten. There was, in fact, one survivor of the family of Georg Donatus and Cecilia. Contrary to some initial confused reports, their youngest child, the 1-year-old Princess Johanna, had not been on the plane. Being so young, she had been left behind in Darmstadt with her nannies. In an instant, she had become an orphan. The newly married Prince Louis and Princess Margaret, their own honeymoon overshadowed by immense grief, did not hesitate. They legally adopted their niece, the last living link to the brother and sister-in-law they had so tragically lost. For a brief time it seemed that a small piece of Cecilia's legacy would survive. Little Johanna was raised in the palace at Wolfsgarten, surrounded by the love of her new parents, but fate had not finished with this cursed family. In 1939, less than 2 years after her parents' death, Johanna fell ill with meningitis. In that pre-antibiotic era, the disease was almost always a death sentence. After a short, brutal illness, the little girl died. She was just 2.5 years old. This final tragedy is almost too cruel to contemplate. The lone survivor, the single spark of hope that remained from Cecilia's family, was also extinguished. Princess Alice, who had recently been released from the sanatorium and was slowly reconnecting with her family, had visited and grown to love her little granddaughter. The loss of Johanna was, for her, the final crushing blow. Johanna was buried at Rosenhöhe, next to the parents and brothers she had never really known, completing the family tomb. So, what do we take away from the brief, beautiful, and profoundly tragic life of Princess Cecilia of Greece and Denmark? We see a life lived in the shadow of falling empires and immense personal turmoil. A woman who sought to build a sanctuary of love and family against the backdrop of a world descending into darkness. We see the fragility of happiness and the terrifying randomness of fate. Her story is a powerful testament to the fact that royalty and privilege are no shield against the deepest sorrows of the human experience. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable intersections of personal lives and larger, darker political movements. And in the legend of her final moments, whether truth or comforting myth, we are invited to reflect on the nature of courage. Perhaps true courage is not about fighting against the inevitable, but about finding a deep, quiet purpose within it. The story of Cecilia is not a grand tale of queens and crowns. It is an intimate human tragedy. It's the story of a daughter, a sister, a wife, and a mother whose love for her family defined her life and, in the end, her death. Her legacy is not one of power or politics, but a quiet, haunting echo, a reminder of the lives beautifully lived and tragically lost in the turbulent currents of history. It's a reminder that every name in the history books belongs to a person with a story, and some stories, like Cecilia's, are so heartbreaking they deserve never to be forgotten.